Tell me how you got to know and meet and interview Lou Elizondo.
Because of sources here in Las Vegas, all UFO roads lead to Las Vegas at one point or another. I knew there was a guy in the position that Lou had. I didn't know what his name was. I didn't know what the name of the program was. I just knew there was a program, and I knew there was a guy like him that led it. In October of 2017, Lou Elizondo walked out onto a stage in Seattle with Tom DeLonge, Hal Puthoff, and a couple of other folks from To the Stars Academy, and he announced to the world that yes, he had been in charge of this program. There was a UFO study, and I think it was shocking to anyone who was watching it. It was especially shocking to his former colleagues at the Pentagon who had no idea that he was going to make this announcement.
Once he made that announcement, how did we get to the point where we were interviewing him?
2 days after he was on that stage in Seattle, Lou Elizondo came to Las Vegas, and I was at a dinner meeting with he and 3 other people, and I got to meet him in person and get to know him. I saw the videos that he was going to release a couple months later, and I knew he was onto some pretty big things. So I made a point to stay in contact with him. In December of 2017, the New York Times story explodes. Lou Elizondo's name is all over the world, and we made a point of, since the story was out, to get him on camera.
Is it a threat? And if it's a threat, is it Russian? Is it Chinese? And yet, these are all normal questions you would ask, whether you're dealing with terrorism or weapons of mass destruction or any issue du jour, right? National security issue du jour. And yet, here we are with something that
doesn't fit.
Doesn't fit. And yet, no, you think that from an intel perspective, that'd be exactly where you'd want to put it. And yet, that's the last place anybody wanted it to be, because it wasn't well defined, and that is something that, from a national security perspective, the government isn't built to respond to problems in which they're very poorly defined. You don't know what it is, you don't know how it works, and you damn sure can't do anything about it. So, it puts us kind of in a weird, catch-22. Yes, we need to look at it because we don't know how it works, but we don't have any real recommendations to the boss. So where does that leave us, right? I don't want to be the guy to go to the Secretary of Defense, oh, by the way, the guy who's named Mad Dog of all Secretary of Defenses, and tell Mad Dog, we got a problem and we don't know how it works and we don't know what it is and there's nothing we can do about it right now. That's not a good conversation to get in with the Secretary of Defense, right? And yet that was my job. And when people above me didn't want to allow us to have that conversation with the boss, my personal experiences, here's a man who likes to operate with more information, not less, right? And you can't even tell him that there's a potential problem, even though we're spending taxpayer money to do it. Then I think there's even that, in fact, to me, is more of a threat than the threat itself. That's more of a national security issue, the fact that we can't tell the boss there's a problem, more than the problem itself. And so, that was really one of the fundamental reasons why I decided to leave when I did.
I'll come back to that. Let's talk about the ride for you. You knew this was going to create an uproar. Is it what you expected? What the reaction, the media reaction, the public reaction?
Oh my goodness. I'm not sure I knew what to expect at all. Frankly speaking, my intent was to leave government service and maybe out of ignorance on my part, fade off into the sunset. Maybe go work at one of the big supermarket chains or go drive a truck or something, and fade off into the sunset. I think, given the topic of what we're talking about, I think, given the fact that it is an emotional topic for many, many people, and rightfully so. I think people have invested a large amount of energy and time and patience and resources trying to get to the truth. And I think when the government finally came out and acknowledged, yes, we had a program, and by the way, yes, we still have a program as of 3 months ago. I think it's natural for people to react the way they did. And as you're gonna have the full spectrum of reactions, right? So on one side, you're gonna have some folks that are very, very excited that this information finally came out and that this information, the government's being truthful and disclosure, so to speak. And then you have the other side of the spectrum where, this type of acknowledgement in some cases could be a bit of a hard pill to swallow.
It's a threat to their worldview.
It could be, yeah, absolutely, and it could be a threat to many things. The way they view the world, certainly, the way they potentially view religion, and their place in the world, and their place with religion. It can be scary, right? Because for the first time, you're sailing above that horizon, and the ship's mast finally disappears over the horizon, and your view of the shore is now gone. And so you're in uncharted territory. What does that mean? What's your place, if you will, what's your place on this ocean? And is there a destination out there that we're going towards? So
Seems like I was clicking around the channels, and there's Lou on the channel day after day. You're doing all these interviews.
Yeah.
And I guess you expected that, but then it goes away. It's like, like it dropped off a cliff.
So issues du jour, right? I'm sure this is you're probably more familiar with this line of work than I am when it comes to media and whatnot. I think the attention span of the American people is, whatever issue is hot today will probably not be so hot tomorrow. My only desire here and hope is that we at least can now start the conversation without people feeling some sense of stigma, or they have to whisper somewhere in the dark corners and the recesses of the rooms and back alleys about this topic, because in the end, I think that is what is potentially, from my perspective, the greatest threat of all. The fact that we have something going on that we can't talk about, right? If you can't communicate there's a problem, then you can't address the problem. I think if you were to take this issue that we've seen, and you have something coming into our airspace, or the airspace we control, that has maybe a Russian star on the tail, or has North Korean tail numbers, I think people would have a much different reaction and response, because there's something we can identify and say, that is in our airspace and shouldn't be here. You DOD, you CIA, you DHS have the responsibility of protecting us. How did this happen? And yet, here we have that same scenario, but there are no flags and tail numbers on the tail. In fact, there may not even be a tail on some of these things. And yet it's crickets. Nobody wants to have the conversation. As far as the short memory and attention span of the American people, well, that's understandable. It's no different even in the Department of Defense. One day you have an issue with terrorism. The next day you have an issue with weapons of mass destruction and proliferation. The next day you may have instability in a particular country. So it's a very dynamic environment we're working in. I'm not surprised that the attention to this has maybe subsided some, but I think this is a long game. I think this is a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that we need to have this conversation over a long period of time. People like you need to ask the hard questions and have the courage to continue looking at this.
A lot of what's come out has been attacks on you, on your integrity, that you're you're some kind of a political puppet, disinformation, counter intel operation, spreading this for whatever nefarious purposes. On one hand, you got the UFO conspiracy people, and then you got scientists who don't want to take it seriously at all. Well, the U in UFO is unidentified, they'll say, as if we shouldn't be concerned about it. A range of reactions to you. I would think for a guy who's used to operating in the shadows, that would be unusual for you.
It is unusual, very uncomfortable. But unfortunately, I can't convince, my job isn't to convince anybody what I'm telling anybody is true. In fact, I think healthy skepticism is very important. So I would encourage anybody who sees someone like me on TV making some sort of proclamation about something like this should always have some healthy degree of skepticism and should be asking the hard questions. But in the end, the beauty about this, I think, this effort is that the data speaks for itself. You don't have to believe me. In fact, I don't want you to believe me. I want you to go and seek the data and look at the data and let the data speak for itself. And if I've accomplished only that, then I've accomplished my mission. If this was some sort of mass misinformation campaign, this would probably be the most colossally, historically worst example of some sort of misinformation campaign that we could do. My job is not to misinform the American public. In fact, I left the Department of Defense and left everything behind, a great job with a great pension and a great retirement and great health care and pretty much everything. I was at the top of my game in my career field. And I left it all to have this conversation with the American public. There was nothing in it for me. In fact, if this was some sort of get-rich-quick scheme, again, I can think of a lot better ways to do it than to put yourself out in front of the American public and take arrows.
Would you have left if you didn't have a place like this to go? I mean, that's what people ask. Well, why
Sure.
would a guy like you, your credibility, Steve Justice, and the other member, and Jim Semivan, why are they on stage with this rock star guy and cooperating with him? Nobody would tell him anything serious or world shaking.
Sure. Well, my decision to leave the government had nothing to do with Coming to the Stars, Academy of Arts and Science. That was after I made that decision to leave. I was approached, and if you were to take just 5 minutes and see who is part of this organization, yes, it's an organization that was run by a former rock star, but I would also submit to you that give credit where credit is due. You're talking about an amazing visionary. Okay, people say, well, Tom is this rock star who happens to be dabbling in UFOs. That's not the case. I think what history will show over time is that Tom has been one hell of a visionary and happens to be also a talented musician on the side. And I think eventually history will remember him for that. But more importantly, you said it yourself, folks like Steve Justice, this is an organization that is building aircraft today we won't see for 50 years, right? The best of the best. An organization that has someone like Hal Puthoff, who's a legend in his own time. I know coming up to the Army when I was a young individual, not young soldier, hearing stories about Hal, truly a giant and a visionary in his career field. Theoretical physics, right? You're talking about that, not easy subjects to necessarily have a handle on, and these are the masters of their field. Jim Semivan, Chris Mellon, the list goes on and on and on and on. You have other individuals that are part of this organization too that are not quite as public, but incredible minds. I mean, if you look at the amount of PhDs and doctors that are on the advisory board and on part of the corporate structure, it's humbling. I think I'm the only guy, I'm probably the token dumb guy, because all these folks are a hell of a lot smarter than I am. So if you're given an opportunity to be part of a team of giants, who wouldn't take that opportunity to help change the world in a positive way?
When you and I first met, you told me that you had been at this for 10 years, about 10 years. So 07, can you describe for me what program existed before 07, how something like the Nimitz would have been handled?
Sure.
Where it goes, and how it became different under ATIP and BASS?
Sure. So I think what ATIP accomplished, starting in 07 with my predecessor, keep in mind I came in 2008 and I really didn't take over until about 2010. What they were successful doing at a very early time, to include the efforts of Harry Reid and the other senators, was to be able to at a relatively senior level that allowed all the disparate pieces of information to come to a single location. That hadn't been done before. So when you had an incident like the Nimitz, you had unfortunately an opportunity for information to kind of get lost in the white noise, right? Someone might report something here, there might be a video there that gets locked away in some safe, never to be seen again. Not necessarily deliberately trying to hide information, but let's face it, the Navy is a big organization. The Air Force is a huge organization. DOD, even bigger, right? So,
and it does no one any good to make a big fuss about this, their career.
Well, of course it does. There's a huge amount of stigma associated with this too. These are individuals who have top secret clearances. They're in charge, as I said before, of multi-million-dollar weapon platforms. In fact, they're trusted to fly live munitions over American cities and fight wars on behalf of us as the American taxpayer. And yet there's this stigma that if they report something that maybe seems a little bit maybe on the side here of maybe that's not very definable, then that causes people potentially to put their flight status in jeopardy, people to question maybe their mental stability, and a whole bunch of negative consequences that result from someone just trying to do the right thing. Look, you go into any major metropolitan area, you go on, ride the metro or the subway, and it says, or any airport, see something, say something, right? If it's suspicious, report it. Hey, I don't care if I see a luggage, there that's been abandoned, I'm gonna go ahead, or a bag, I'm gonna report it anyways, or even a McDonald's bag, I'm gonna report it. And yet, in the Department of Defense, it's the exact opposite. In fact, unless you know what it is, don't say anything. Keep quiet, because it could impact you negatively. And we have seen before, time and time again, there is this undercurrent that when someone does report something, there is this immediate reaction to try to discredit the individuals. Not only to our pilots, I have personally experienced it over the last 3 months. It becomes pretty visceral at times. And so pilots who are good patriots, these are men and women that are our front lines, that serve their country silently and they serve it proudly, yet they can't report what they're seeing. And why is that? Again, because it's not well defined, because it doesn't have a Russian star on the tail, it doesn't have a tail number, they can't report it.
So Nimitz is an example. I mean, there's a fairly dramatic incident, well documented, that gets stuffed in a drawer somewhere.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't get studied
Right.
until ATIP gets,
Right.
You guys get up and running.
Right, and I think there's many instances. People say, oh, the Nimitz incident. Well, that's one that people know of, because that's the one that has been on social media and is fairly common right now in the public sphere. But there are many, many Nimitz incidences that are equally compelling, that are told from the eyes of individuals just like Commander Dave Fravor, folks that are true patriots, Top Gun graduates, folks that are trained observers, millions of dollars invested to teach these pilots how to observe things in the air. These folks are the best of the best. I mean, Dave Fravor was the commander of the Black Aces. It doesn't get better than that. And yet when he tells you he's seen something go from a near hover or something that is over the water going at 450 knots and all of a sudden takes off over the horizon in 2 seconds, you better believe what he's telling you he's seen. And by the way, that's backed up by 3 other individuals that were also on that same flight in 2 aircraft. And then later by the radar operators, and then later by 2 more F-18s afterwards. So I think people need to really look at this. Let the data speak for itself. Let the information we receive from electro-optical data and electromechanical mechanisms be the tool in which we can look and compare what the eyewitness testimony is saying and compare that to what we are seeing in the actual collection capabilities that we have as a country. Keep in mind, we have equipment, without going into a lot of detail, that is designed to tell you as a pilot very quickly what you're looking at 50 miles away. Is it a drone? Is it a missile? Is it an aircraft? What the heck is it? And not only what is it, where it was built, and who built it and who owns it, right? We pay a lot of taxpayer money for these capabilities. And when the equipment that we have, whether it's on our aircraft and it's coming from our boats and sometimes from other capabilities, is all coming up with a 0. It frustrates me because people say, well, that's just IR glare. That's IR fuzz, or that's an atmospheric condition.
A bug on the windshield.
Right, I say, look, atmospheric conditions you cannot lock a radar onto. So I'm sorry, it's not atmospheric. And IR fuzz, we have capabilities. Again, I can't go into detail because some of it gets sensitive very quickly, but we know if it's IR fuzz. We know ahead of time what it is, if it is truly some sort of IR heat glare. That's not what we're seeing here. And people will say, well, the video is very short, you don't know what you're looking at. Well, that's true. The reason why some of these videos are short is because we have to protect sources and methods in the Department of Defense. And it's quite possible that within a few seconds after that portion that people see, the conversation becomes classified. So it's not that, oh, there's just a short snippet and the government's trying to fool us and that's why the video is very short. The video is short probably because what happens afterwards is classified. So we can't talk about classified information.
The tic-tac in that incident, that's not Russian, that's not Chinese, it's not ours, right? It's somebody else's. It's from somewhere else.
I think even more compelling. Look, if this was a tic-tac that we saw in 2004, that would have been extremely advanced technology and capabilities for 2004. I think everybody would agree. It's extreme. It is considered extreme exotic technology today, let alone in 2004. But these observations match with previous observations going well before that. So if a country like Russia or China had this capability back then and has managed to keep it secret all this time, then my hat's off to them. But I think those technologies would have seen manifested in other things that are probably more useful than a simple drone flying over the coast of San Diego. They probably would have used it for something a little bit more strategically important.
If we had that technology then or now, I mean, it would give us mastery, even more mastery of the skies against adversaries than we have already.
Absolutely. And there's utility in that goes beyond reconnaissance, okay? If you truly had the ability to take something from point A to point B that quickly, then you probably wouldn't just simply waste that capability on something that allows you to collect information on a exercise somewhere out in the South China Sea. You're going to use that capability when you really, really, really need it, and you're not going to risk exposing that capability to the world just because you want to do a test drive and see what the Nimitz is doing off the coast of California.
I was told by someone that one reason that you left your job is because there are other Tic-Tac incidents since then, also dramatic, perhaps with increasing frequency, and that this is not unusual anymore.
So, forgive me, Mr. Knapp, if I can't answer this question as completely as you would like, because there are some sensitivities, and I'm no longer employed by the U.S. government, so there are some left and right limits I have to pay attention to. I'm still bound by my non-disclosure agreement, and I still have a security clearance, or at least I think I do. So as a result, I have to be a little bit mindful of that. But I will tell you that the Nimitz is simply an example of one case, one event in time of many that we looked at. And I think that is why this is so important, because it's not a single incident. Don't believe me. Don't look at it just one time and say, hey, we saw this thing and we don't know what it is, and therefore all of a sudden we all need to now engage on this. When it continues to happen as a pattern, that is when we get to the point where we now become increasingly concerned. Because it's not an anomaly, now it's a trend. And if it's a trend, then we need to look at it, right? And
Let me ask you another question you can't answer. I was told about that there was an incident in that Nimitz period, over those several days, where there was a USO as well. I mean, some of the descriptions that Dave Fravor and his colleagues have, that there was something under the water. And one report is that it reached up and grabbed something. Can you talk about that?
I'm aware of that incident. I can't speak about it too much right now, but what I can tell you is that there are some interesting comments. In the world of intelligence, we are trained to find patterns amongst pieces of information that appear to be nonsensical. And what we have been able to do is determine there are some specific patterns that we continue to see and observe with these type of incidents that are occurring. And so it is quite common to see these things potentially over water. There have been many, many reports that these things potentially, so let's put it this way. Imagine an object, if I may borrow your pen for a second. Imagine an object that is supposed to fly in Earth's atmosphere. It's going to have a very specific shape. It's going to be aerodynamic, it's going to have a front, and it's going to have a back. There's going to be a point for exhaust, there's going to be flight surfaces for it to maneuver in atmosphere. If you have this same vehicle and you want it to operate in outer space, well, it's going to have different characteristics. It doesn't need wings, it doesn't need certain things because it's flying in a vacuum environment. It's going to have thrusters, not jet engines, right? And so it's going to look different. Think of the Apollo 11 lunar lander module compared to a 747. They look really different, and yet the lunar lander goes a hell of a lot faster than any 747 does. And you wouldn't think it does, but it does. And then lastly is a boat or a submarine. That looks significantly different than something that goes in outer space and something that flies in the atmosphere. And yet what we're seeing here is potentially an object, this pen, that can potentially fly equally well both in an atmosphere environment, a vacuum environment, and potentially a very thick type medium or a water environment.
How about Earth?
So that's a great question. I don't know. I can tell you though that from our perspective, anything that has the ability to fly in some sort of transmedium, if you will, between water and atmosphere and space, we probably need to look at. It's not that the technology doesn't exist. There are, I mean, obviously we have things that can fly and all sorts of stuff, but it's very unusual and it's very expensive. And usually there's always a sacrifice. If you want something to fly really well in the atmosphere, it's not going to fly so well in the water or in space.
But these things can.
Well,
It looks like
they seem to be able to fly pretty well pretty much anywhere.
Gimbal and Tic Tac are different things,
They are.
and from different incidents.
They are.
Different places in the country.
Correct.
The first time you showed me gimbal, it looks like it looks like an aura around it, and you said, "We think we might know how they work." Do you? You know?
I think we are very close to understanding the physics. So my job in the government at the time really regarding ATIP was twofold. To determine what it was and how it worked. Not really focusing on, as I said before, who's behind the steering wheel or their intent. I figured if we can answer at least those two first things, everything else we'll be able to explain later. So sad to say, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is we're not any closer to understanding now what it is than we were before. But the good news is, ironically enough, I think we've come very, very close to understanding the physics of how it works. And that's very exciting. That is for the first time we have a very compelling picture that what we are seeing is absolutely explained by our current understanding of physics and advanced physics and quantum mechanics, but these things are displaying things that we can see behave at a much micro level in places like the CERN and Large Hadron Collider. So from our perspective, I think the ability to understand how something works puts us a lot closer to understanding what it actually is. We do believe that now for the first time, perhaps all these observables that we've been seeing, for example, sudden and extreme acceleration, hypersonic velocities, low observability, transmedium travel, and last but not least, positive lift or anti-gravity, is really a manifestation of a single technology. So it's not 5 exotic technologies we're trying to figure out how it works. It's one, and we think we know that one too.
Can you name it, or you got to keep that? Is it electrogravitic? Is it space-time distortion?
I think it has to do what we have collectively looking at the mathematical models and looking at the scientific studies that have been done. We believe that it has to do with a high amount of energy and the ability to warp space-time, and not by a lot, just a little bit. In fact, warping space-time is something we see in the natural world all the time. So we see with GPS satellites. In fact, the GPS satellites right now, everybody has on their phone, oh, I'm going to see where I'm at today. Those clocks have to be calibrated and recalibrated, even though those cesium clocks on those satellites are exactly the same as the ones we have on the ground station. They have to constantly be calibrated. And the reason why is because the effects of Earth's gravity has on the space-time of those cesium clocks here on Earth relative to those cesium clocks that are on those platforms that are above Earth. In fact, the clocks that are above Earth compared to the ones on Earth are running slightly faster. Now, how is that possible if they're the exact same type of clocks? Well, that is because the effects of Earth's gravity, the closer you are to a massive object, the more space-time is warped. And we've seen that with Einstein's relativity. And it all boils down to E equals mc squared, basically. What we're talking about is lots of mass or lots of energy to warp space-time. The closer you get to a supermassive object like the sun, the greater that distortion occurs. In fact, when you get to a black hole, time is so distorted that time stands still. So we know, we've seen this. We've seen it with gravitational lensing. When we're looking at a far distant galaxy, we can see the effects gravity has on space-time. We can actually see it with our eyes. So we don't have to prove that. That is science fact, not science fiction. So the question is, technologically, how can we go ahead and manipulate that physics to our benefit? So now we can potentially warp space-time in a way that allows us to go from point A to point B a little faster.